From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans, and on this episode, I am joined by Glennis McClure, an Extension Educator and Farm and Ranch Management Analyst with UNL Center for Ag Profitability in the Department of Agricultural Economics. Glennis recently authored an article titled Determining a Fair Rent for Farm Buildings, which outlines the key factors involved in establishing a fair and equitable rental rate for farm buildings. From calculating fixed and variable costs to considering depreciation and local market conditions, determining rent for these assets is a nuanced process that can require careful evaluation. We'll discuss how property owners can make informed decisions and why understanding both the owners' and the renters' perspectives is crucial in setting fair rents. Hey, Glennis, thanks for joining me again.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, Ryan. Thanks.
And we'll encourage listeners to check out the article. It's linked to in the podcast description, wherever you're listening to this, and on our Center for Ag Profitability website at cap.unl.edu. And Glennis, if you could just start by kind of giving an overview of what some of the key factors are when you're determining a fair rent for farm buildings.
Okay, sure. So as we know, as we think about farm buildings, and this could include even grain bins, or, livestock facilities, sheds, all of those kinds of things. As we know, there's just, with buildings, there's no set formula, so to speak. The conditions of a building can be so varied. The type of building, of course, if it's, again, a livestock barn or a livestock facility versus a grain storage facility or just a machine shed, what the usage is going to be. And really also understanding the local market and what's around and what's available, and understanding those conditions, I think, is really important. So, for instance, if a grain bin is in good working condition, we might have a rental figure in mind, but what is the going rate in the area? Things that we have to ask ourselves. And again, are electrical and grain dryers hooked up and are working, with that grain bin? So if so, that could add to the rent amount depending on whatever rental arrangement or negotiation, we come up with. And a machine shed that is going to be used for storage can vary widely based on its age, its condition, of course, its size. Does it actually hold what you want it to hold, right? The location and just, various different factors. So overall, a comprehensive evaluation of both fixed and variable costs, as we talk about in the article, as well as cash and non-cash expenses, is essential. I do have here, aside from those fixed and variables that we'll talk about here in a little bit, I do have a list of items to consider. And I've already mentioned size. So larger buildings with greater capacity generally command higher rent due to increased utility. Repairs, again, whatever that condition of that building is in can affect the maintenance cost. And we need to consider, again, in that rental arrangement, who's going to handle the repairs. Again, even just thinking of security and monitoring the facility and how that's all going to be managed is something to consider. And insurance. So what's that actual usage? And, what is that? That can be a real significant factor to consider. Who's paying the insurance? Are those costs covered, in your rental arrangement? Again, I've mentioned several times now the condition. A newer, well-maintained building, obviously can command a higher rent than an older one that's really deteriorating. Location, again, is it along a main road? Is it, back in the woods where it's hard to get to? What's the market around it? What's the availability of other structures around that area? And so on. So just what is the desirability of that building can really affect that rental rate. And then just a couple more things. I mentioned risks of accidents, the type of usage. So buildings used for high-risk operations or intensive farming may require higher rent to cover those potential liabilities. And then we also have to think about, again, if we're thinking about, if there's buildings or there's houses nearby or other activities in the area, what's the noise factor going to be with the usage of that building? Is there odor? Again, if we're talking about livestock, how's it going to affect those around? And, what's that traffic? What's that going to bring in? I know, like on our farm, we have grain bins, and there's times of the year where there's a lot of traffic because the trucks are rolling, and does that make a difference in our perspective as owners right there in our houses, and that traffic, that truck traffic.
And could there also be legal barriers to that, like or regulatory barriers, and especially in the case of like livestock and odor nuisances
yes.
and things?
And so there can be some local laws or local ordinances that you have to consider. And also, I was just thinking, as you mentioned that, legally too, what is the access? Is wherever that building is that set up so that whoever's using it has legal access to those roads or to get back to the usage of those buildings.
Good point. Yeah. So as you were going through that, my mind was like, oh, yep, you're right. Stuff I would never have thought about when I think, oh, let's list a building for rent. So you talk about fixed and variable costs. So in that vein, can you just break down those categories, fixed and variable costs, explain how they could each factor into rental decisions?
Right. So, as an owner, on the owner side of things, and that's kind of the perspective that I wrote this article, although later again, we talk about the perspective of the renter, but we should make sure that our fixed costs are covered always. And that is, the fixed costs are when a facility is in, it's there, those costs are there, whether the facility is in use or not, for the most part, okay? So depreciation. So as we know, as a building just sits, oftentimes we hear an unused building actually depreciates faster, all right? So there is some consideration in, hey, if I can get this building rented and it's useful, maybe, there's some value to that, okay? But buildings lose value over time generally, and depreciation is a non-cash cost that's should be factored into rent. Now you have to ask yourself, is that building already depreciated out? And yes, there is that whole issue of depreciation on your taxes, so you may not have anything to put as far as depreciation on your taxes. That may be already done and over. But depreciation really has to do with what's remaining, I guess, as far as the life of it and so on. So then property taxes. So yeah, if there is a building and it's still in the tax rolls, there is still sort of a tax assessment, we want to make sure we're covering our property taxes, which is a fixed cost. Insurance, I've already mentioned insurance. And again, it can be insured for liability or physical damages. And so that obviously, again, depending on the condition, the age, all those kinds of things will make a difference in that insurance. But definitely we got to think about that liability issue if it's being used. Repairs again are generally fixed. But then though those can change, they can also be variable depending on the usage. And then interest costs. So it could be that, if there's still a loan or debt on the building, there's obviously interest that's still being paid. But the other thing that we think about in economics is the opportunity cost of ownership, and that's a non-cash cost. And that reflects what could be earned if the building were sold and the funds invested elsewhere. Now, not all of our farm buildings can be moved, can be sold, all those kinds of things. So that's one of those factors that you really have to stop and think a little bit about. Should that be a factor that I include in my rent figure? So then variable costs, they can fluctuate with a building's usage. So again, fixed is fixed, variables, can change with usage. So repairs based on usage. Again, if there's a high usage or there might be a lot of repairs, you got to figure that in. Again, insurance might make a difference depending on how it's used and so on. Utilities, though, of course, will vary. Is there a lot of utilities that are going to be utilized in the use of that building? So,
great, thanks. And then you mentioned that you wrote this article sort of from the point of view of an owner of a building, but what are some considerations or things you would recommend when it comes to balancing the owner's perspective with the willingness to pay for the renter?
All right. So again, we're trying to make some estimates or look at covering our costs, but we also, probably should think about the tenant and and to try to make some estimates, in their situation. And it should help to get an idea of what your building might be worth if you consider the prospective renter's point of view. So for one, of course, we want to consider what is that potential user willing or able to pay? How will the renter or the tenant's gross income change or increase, if at all? So if they're if they want to use that building to, let's say, to feed some livestock, obviously that's a situation where their, chances are their gross income is going to increase. So that's positive, right? Or let's say they want to preserve their equipment more. Again, that's a positive thing for them. So they want to rent the shed that's just sitting there and can cover their expensive equipment. Okay, so again, what expenses are they covering, by renting the building? How, again, you got to think about, again, from their perspective, how far are they from the facility? Are they 20, 30 miles away? Is that building going to be secure? Who's going to monitor all of that? So those are some questions that they may be asking too, in the perspective of how much rent can they pay or should they pay? So does the bottom line for them cover any risks and management after rent and additional expenses are paid? Again, we recognize that the figure you arrive at as the potential earnings of your building is only a starting point for bargaining. The level of rent you will get depends on the relative supply and demand for building rental in your area. And that, of course, can change from time to time, and also, again, the willingness to pay.
And lastly, you mentioned something that we talk a lot about here, which is the need for written agreements in these rental arrangements. So could you just explain why it's so important to formalize agreements in writing, and what are some of the key details that should be included in those agreements? Okay,
same as what we have with land rent, we talk about a lot, is that rental for a farm building or facility. Again, that written lease is really, pretty important. And there's a number of reasons why. I kind of list those here. You just don't want to have misunderstandings to take place during or upon the conclusion of the leases, the timeline of the lease. So what's typically covered in a written lease? So we would spell out the lease terms, of course, the rent amount and when that rent is due. Is it due on a monthly basis? Is it due quarterly, semi-annually, or annually? You've got to spell those things out. And what is that time period of that lease? And then how is the lease to be terminated? What are the notification requirements? So if I decide as the landlord that I want my tenant to give that facility up, what are the steps I need to take to let them know? Should it be a written notification, verbal? What should it be? So, and I think the rental arrangement can specify who has the right to enter and inspect the facility. Generally, both the owner and the tenant have that right, but of course we need to know that, and how that's spelled out. Can the tenant sublease the facility? Usually that's a no, but that can be also included. What happens if there's a death of the owner? What is that rental arrangement binding on the heirs? That's included in there. And so again, what is the process and fees that can be included if the operator fails to pay? So how does that sort of thing handled? The lease can spell out who will do general building maintenance and who pays for utilities and insurance. If the building has livestock in it or another commodity, the operator must have insurance coverage on it and not hold the property owner liable for whatever's in that building, of course. How will damages of use or wear and tear be paid for? And in the case of a livestock facility, again, who will take care of cleaning up and moving manure when it's necessary? So really, there's a long list of considerations that can be addressed in a written lease. And we have a resource that we refer to often, again, with land leases, but there is also an example, a great example, and a template at aglease101.org that folks can take a look at online and create their rental arrangements and work through that with potential renters.
Yeah, and as we always talk about, it's just a little bit more work up front, but it's going to save so many headaches in the long run, getting that lease in writing. So Glennis McClure, thank you very much for joining me on Nebraska Farmcast. Again, we encourage listeners to check out Glennis's new article on determining a fair rent for farm buildings. That's on our center's website at cap.unl.edu. We'll also put that link to Ag Lease 101 in there so you can find your way to a sample building lease template on their website too. So Glennis, thanks again for joining me.
And thank you, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.